Hi, I'm Anna, and welcome to the Sompo Deep Cut. When I first started preparing for D3, I kept running into the same problem: too many grapes, too many traits, too many details that refuse to stay put. Budding dates blurred into ripening windows, disease pressure into canopy management, and somehow none of it felt exam ready. What finally helped wasn't learning more grapes, it was learning which grapes do the most explanatory work. That's where the idea of a core 25 came from. Not a list to memorize, but a set of varieties that examiners return to again and again because they explain how wine works. If you understand these grapes properly, how they behave in the vineyard, how they respond to soils, and how those decisions show up in the glass, you can unlock most D3 essays without panic. But today, I don't want to walk through 25 grapes. I want to slow down and deep dive a handful of anchor varieties because these are the ones that teach you how to think. Let's start with Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet is late ripening, thick skinned, and naturally high in tannin. On its own, that tells us very little. What matters is where you put it. Cabernet needs time and warmth to ripen fully, not just sugar ripeness, but tannin maturity. This is why gravel soils matter so much. Gravel drains freely, but more importantly, it retains and re radiates heat, warming the root zone and extending the ripening period. That interaction explains why Cabernet thrives on the gravel soils of the Medoc, why it reaches structure and balance in Napa Valley, and why it struggles in cooler or heavier soils where ripening can stall. Late ripening plus heat retentive soils equals structured age worthy wines. That's not trivia, that's exam logic. Now contrast that with Merlot. Merlot buds earlier, ripens earlier, and is more drought sensitive than Cabernet. It doesn't need the same heat accumulation, but it does need reliable water supply through the growing season. This is why clay soils are so important for Merlot. Clay retains water, reducing hydric stress in dry summers and allowing Merlot to maintain vine function and even ripening. That single soil to variety interaction explains why Merlot excels on the right bank in Bordeaux, producing plush, approachable wines, and why it can struggle on free draining gravel unless water stress is carefully managed. Same region, different soil, different grape, completely different style outcome. Once you see that contrast, you've learned more than two grapes. You've learned how examiners expect you to reason. Now let's look at Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir has thin skins, buds early, and ripens early. It is sensitive to stress, prone to uneven ripening, and quickly loses balance if conditions are too warm or too dry. This makes soil choice critical. Pinot performs best on well drained but not excessively warm soils, often clay limestone, which balance drainage with enough water retention to avoid stress. That interaction explains Burgundy's classic styles and why site selection is everything for Pinot in places like Oregon. Pinot isn't about power, it's about precision, and the soil has to support that. Then there's Chardonnay, one of the most useful thinking tools in D3. Chardonnay is relatively neutral aromatically and highly responsive to site and winemaking. That's why it appears everywhere in the syllabus. On limestone soils, acidity feels sharper and structure is more linear. On deeper or clay influenced soils, texture broadens and weight increases. Chardonnay teaches you to separate structure from flavor and to explain why the same grape can produce Chablis, Meursault, Margaret River, or Sonoma, not by magic, but through soil, climate, and human choice. Now consider Riesling. Riesling is late budding, late ripening, and naturally high in acidity. It thrives where ripening is slow and even, and where soils limit vigor rather than push growth. This is why poor stony soils, slate, schist, gravel, matter so much for Riesling. They restrict yields, encourage concentration, and support long ripening without dilution. That interaction underpins classic styles in Germany and Alsace and explains Riesling's ability to combine delicacy with longevity. Again, the grape only makes sense once you add the soil. Now let's talk briefly about Grenache because it often gets misunderstood. Grenache buds early, ripens late, has thin skins, and accumulates sugar easily. It is well adapted to warm, dry conditions and performs best on poor, drought resistant soils that limit vigor and control yields. That interaction explains its success in the southern Rhone, Spain, and parts of Australia, and also why Grenache often relies on blending to add structure and balance. High alcohol isn't an accident, it's a varietal response to environment. And finally, Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo buds early and ripens very late, making it vulnerable to spring frost and autumn rain. It needs long, slow ripening to achieve phenolic maturity. That's why site choice is everything: slope, aspect, and soils that support drainage and moderate vigor. Nebbiolo teaches you that ripening risk is part of quality, not a flaw, and that great wines often come from managing tension rather than avoiding it. All of these grapes are part of what I call the Core 25, which I've written about in more detail in my Substack article, D3 Cheat Sheet Grapes That Matter. You'll find the link in my editor notes and comments. What I suggest and what helped me most is building your own factor, cause, effect, style grid for these anchor grapes. You don't need to do it for all 25 at once. Start with Cabernet or Pinot or Riesling. Pick one grape and ask, what does this grape need? What threatens it? And how do soils and climate either solve or amplify those risks? That's when D3 stops feeling like memorization and starts feeling like reasoning. You don't need to know everything. You need to understand a few things deeply and explain them clearly. That's what earns marks, and that's what stays with you long after the exam. I do hope you enjoyed listening, and I'll see you on the next Deep Cut.